People were on the street. Suddenly I can see this really high water. And I just like, what is that?
The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami was like no other.
It was equivalent to 23,000 Hiroshima-type atomic bombs.
I remember the feeling of the wave passing on my face. It's like immense force.
And then once I resurfaced, I screamed out for Mum and Dad and just heard nothing. Everybody lost somebody.
This elderly couple were hanging on to a railing. I tried to reach them, and they just disappeared.
Nearly 250,000 people left this planet in one day. But I saw hundreds of acts of heroism.
I forgot about my fear. I could not say no to everyone calling for help. You're a good girl. You're a strong girl.
When things are at their darkest, when somebody is in trouble, people want to help. That is the wonderful power of the human spirit.
On this episode of Newt's World, on December 26, 2004, at 7:59 a.m. local time, an undersea earthquake with a magnitude of 9.1 struck off the coast of the Indonesian island of Sumatra. Over the next 7 hours, a tsunami was triggered by the quake and reached across the Indian Ocean, devastating coastal areas all across Southeast Asia and as far away as East Africa. Some coastal towns reported ocean waves that had reached a height of 30 feet or more when they hit the shoreline. This December marks the 20th anniversary of the tsunami disaster that took the lives of 225,000 people. National Geographic Channel is airing a new documentary entitled Tsunami: Race Against Time, which is now streaming on Disney Plus and Hulu. Here to talk about the film, I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, Daniel Bogado, who is the executive producer and director. Daniel, welcome and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Thank you very much for having me.
First, I have to ask you, where were you when we started seeing video images of the tsunami on the news in 2004? It was the day after Christmas, so I think many of us were with our families.
I was with my family as well, and I remember waking up and, like so many people, seeing on the news, huge earthquake off Indonesia, thousands feared dead. And then as the news followed, it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. The number of dead just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And 2005 was the first year I started working on television, making documentaries. I was just getting started, so I could see a lot of people who were producers, directors going out to Asia, bringing back extraordinary stories. And so 20 years later, I thought we could make a very, very powerful documentary series about it.
For the people who aren't familiar with the event, can you sort of give a brief interview of what the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami was like and why it became one of the deadliest natural disasters in history?
Yes, the main thing, it was highly unexpected. It happened in the Indian Ocean, some miles off the coast of Indonesia. There was an underwater quake, and it was huge. I mean, it's one of the biggest that has ever been registered, coming up to a 9.2 in the end. And that generated a huge wall of water that spread in both sides. 14 countries were affected. The ones that were most affected were the closest ones to the quake, which were Indonesia and Thailand, Sri Lanka, India. And it was the coastal populations which were particularly badly affected. There is a tsunami warning center, there was one, in the Pacific, because most tsunamis had been in the Pacific Ocean, so that's where they expected they would come. So they saw the readings, and this is a story that's followed in the documentary. So the scientists there realized this was a big earthquake and realized there was probably a huge tsunami affecting all those countries. But they had nowhere they could call. There were no warning systems in place, no warning centers in place. So it was like seeing an unfolding horror film, and there was nothing they could do about it.
So was the center of the underlying earthquake to the west of Sumatra? So they drove into the Indian Ocean. Because it had been to the east of Sumatra, it would have hit Singapore and it would have gone into the Pacific.
Yeah, it was incredibly close to Sumatra, and at the time it had a conflict. It had a conflict that had been going on for a long time, secessionist rebellion movement. So that meant that it was kind of closed off, particularly from foreigners. It was very difficult to get in or out. We actually tracked down one of the few foreigners who was allowed to be there, who was a surfer called David Lyons, and we profiled his story. So what that meant in effect is if you go to some of the other countries like Thailand or Sri Lanka, there were a lot of Westerners, there were a lot of tourists there, and they filmed quite a lot of what they saw, and many of the images that came afterwards came from the tourists. But Banda Aceh itself didn't have any tourists, and so the people who recorded the tsunami were the journalists whose normal job was to cover the conflict. They would film the conflict and they would send images to Reuters and people like that. And when they saw the tsunami, they just took the cameras and filmed that. But a lot of that material never left Indonesia. And so we traveled there and we met them, we went to TV stations and we tracked down hundreds of hours of video that had never been shown before, which you can see on the documentary.
You mentioned that there were waves that actually reached town. They could have been 30 feet high or more. But also that at its peak in the ocean, it may have been a 100-foot high wave.
So one of the things that happened, it spread on both directions, once towards Thailand, another one towards Sri Lanka. But the wave that spread towards Thailand was much, much slower, while the wave that spread towards Sri Lanka was very, very quick because it was going through open ocean, essentially. So they arrived, even though it had to cross much, much greater distance to get to Sri Lanka on the other side of the Indian Ocean, they arrived more or less at the same time in both locations. And then the second aspect that people don't quite realize is that it's not just one wave. It's several waves. And so people in Phuket, for instance, saw the first wave come, they didn't understand what happened, and then the water goes back. And then everybody thinks, oh, it's over. And everybody goes into the beach and they're looking around, but another wave is coming, often a bigger wave than the first one. And then it happened again and again. On the second episode, we explore this kind of multiple wave phenomenon. So I think often people have the wrong idea of what a tsunami will look like, because often it's not the giant wave. Sometimes it is, but often it's a wall of water that just pushes in, and it can be deceptive. A lot of people were looking at that wall of water and they didn't know what it was. Many lost their lives that way.
I mean, if you've never seen one, it's not obvious that you'd have this kind of an impact.
Absolutely. If you haven't seen one. And also, this was an area where there usually weren't tsunamis. You had to go back a long, long time for the last tsunami. It's actually interesting. There was one group of people that we interviewed who did know. They didn't make it to the series. There was a woman, and they were in Kosurin Island, and they were indigenous people. They're called the sea nomads. They're kind of indigenous people. They travel from island to island. They live and work on boats. And their own ancestors remembered through their myths. There was a myth that said, if you see the water go back, you need to find high land, because they called it the sea monster is coming. So when they saw the water go back, they immediately knew, basically through tradition, and they all found high land. I think only one of them died, because it goes back that further, that long amount of time before there was a tsunami.
So in a sense, the first wave comes in, recedes, and then a potentially even bigger second wave comes in. Are there a routine number of waves involved in a tsunami?
No, it varies a lot. It varies from location to location. And so even in Thailand, where there were a lot of Westerners, you could go to one beach and people would have one type of experience, and then 30 minutes later, it could be much more devastating. And that's because the tsunami in the open ocean, you don't see this giant wave because most of the tsunami is underwater. So if you have a boat that's several miles into the ocean, you'll probably be fine. The problem is when it approaches the coastline, and then it starts getting bigger and bigger and bigger because of the seafloor starts rising. And that's where the problem is. So areas which are very built and have a lot of material, they will slow down the wave. And areas which are quite open and don't have a lot of things blocking. For instance, one of the places that was the most devastated in Thailand was a place called Khao Lak, that people went there because of its natural beauty. And they were by the beach, and we have images it's absolutely devastating when the wave comes. It's absolutely huge and just takes everybody with it.
How did you go about finding survivors who were willing to talk about their experience? I mean, talk about PTSD. There must have been some deep psychological damage done by surviving this.
Oh, absolutely. Particularly in places like Banda Aceh, which were very, very badly hit. And one of our contributors lost 50 members of his family, and that wasn't unusual. I mean, almost half of the people who died just there. Finding survivors, well, basically before this, I worked on a series about 9/11 called 9/11 One Day in America, also for National Geographic. And the idea of that series was we will tell the story of the day only using video archive. So we did this very, very extensive, detailed research period of just tracking down every tape, every image that had been captured of the day. And once we did that, we started searching for the people we could see in the video archive so they could tell their story. And that was a very effective approach because it placed the audience in the middle of the day. It went minute by minute. And also the people who tell their stories, they tell it to you minute by minute. And so you're feeling the experience as they felt it. And it was a very effective way of telling the story. We didn't bring much other details other than the experiences of people. So we decided to do the same with this series. And obviously it was a bigger enterprise because we had to go to Indonesia, we had to go to Thailand, Sri Lanka, and find people there. Often all we had was the image of them in the archive. And so finding them was detective work, very difficult detective work. But we had wonderful teams of researchers and producers working in each country. Many of them were themselves survivors of the tsunami, many of themselves or had family members they had lost. So they were incredibly passionate about the project because we said this is about history, this is about showing what happened that day for future generations, and it's also a memorial for the lives that were lost. And when you explain that to the contributors, and also because a lot of people, somebody who's 20 years old today will have no memory of the tsunami, right? And so something that would serve as educational as well. Once you watch this series, you get a very good idea of what a tsunami is, what the warning signs are. Hopefully it can save some lives.
You're finding local people to help actually make the film in a series. How many of the 14 countries did you go into?
Well, we focused on 3 of them, and then we explore briefly some of them, because basically it was very difficult in one episode to jump from too many countries. So the first one is Indonesia, Banda Aceh. Most of the episode is set there because that was the hardest hit place. And then the next one is Thailand. And then we went to Sri Lanka, where we found extraordinary images that had never been shown before in hospitals. There was the biggest train accident devastation that has ever happened there on the day of the tsunami. So we covered all those stories. The key thing was finding the people in the archive to tell their stories. And there's so many times that you see somebody in the video and you think, oh my God, how did they survive? And then that you start hearing their voice and they start telling you their story. It's something really, really powerful.
You're also using 20-year-old video.
Yeah.
That was most of it digital now, or was it film still, or what kind of things did you have?
Well, so it's interesting how when you work on a certain project of a certain time, it tells you a lot about the technology. So for instance, the 9/11 series that we worked on, we're talking about 2001. A lot of things were just shot on cameras, on mini DV tapes, and a lot of it survived very, very well. So you'd think something that happens 3 years later in 2004, it would be the same, but actually was a bit different because first of all, the locations are different from New York. They're very humid, very wet places. So sometimes people kept the tape, but by the time we found it, it was completely destroyed by the weather, basically. Other times, people would digitize the tape onto a hard drive, but sometimes the hard drive was unrescuable. Other times, it was rescued, but highly compressed. So often it was a huge, huge challenge. It involved a lot of detective work, tracking copies down. Something that was a lot of help was going to broadcasters, to channels, and going to their libraries, and they had saved a lot of material. But what it makes you realize is that we think that because we have all this technology, all this digital technology, all these cameras, when something happens, we have kept the history. And that's not true. Even on 9/11, we had to do a huge amount of detective work to track down tapes, to track down images. They were just not very well organized or very difficult to find sometimes. And in this case, it was the same thing. There were a lot of tapes that we thought, oh, wow, this is extraordinary. And then we found the file was corrupted or the tape was destroyed. It was often quite frustrating. And so that's very important for us to keep our history. But sometimes it's a challenge. We have this assumption because something is digital, it will be saved, but that's just not the case.
I'm curious, because you have been a documentary filmmaker for a good while. How do you choose what to look at?
There's something a bit of intuition that comes, especially for big projects like this, which take about 2 years, actually. And so it happened with 9/11 and it happened with Tsunami. And often, once you've worked for many years making documentaries, you develop an intuition or an instinct of what is an interesting new approach to an old story. And so with 9/11, when it was presented to me, we were told this will be the biggest series ever done on 9/11. We're going to bring all the archive together and we're going to interweave it with the most powerful stories, both known and unknown, on a 6-part series. And I just immediately knew that would be extraordinary because I had read a lot about 9/11, I had seen some of the archive, and I just understood the potential for that project. So we worked on it for 2 years, and I developed the approach. I said, we're not going to do anything else other than video archive and the voices of survivors. There's not going to be a narrator, there's not going to be graphics, it's just going to be those two things. And, you know, for National Geographic, it was the first time they were trying this new approach. Usually they bring a lot of other things. But it was a huge success. It won many awards. It won an Emmy. It was very well received by the audience. And even at the time, I thought, there's not that many other big events where you could use this approach. Because the approach works only if you can bring in video from a lot of different sources. So it has to be a big event where a lot of people got out video cameras to film. I thought the timing was essential. So both of them are 20-year anniversary projects. So it means 20 years is a period of time where the survivors will have had time to process. It will be something in their past, but not so much time that, say, if you were to do something about World War II today, you would struggle to find people who are still alive to tell those stories. So 20 years is a very good period of time. And then bringing together the video archive and then the team of people that I bring the best editors, best cinematographers, best composers, and all of them understand, you know, what we're trying to do with this project. And so it's actually quite an exciting proposition for me and incredibly rewarding work as well.
When you work with somebody like Nat Geo, I think of them as a quality channel, that they're going to support you and invest in you and try to really bring something special.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing with National Geographic as well, because the team I worked with on the Tsunami are the same team that we worked together on 9/11. So there's a lot of trust, right? Because if you're going to commit 2 years of your life to doing a project and you're making promises to the people, the contributors, you're saying this is a serious project. It will not be sensationalist. We're going to treat you and your story with respect. And we're going to be very journalistically rigorous to be accurate at every stage of the moment. And we're doing this as a memorial to the lives that were lost. And we're doing this as well to educate a next generation. So that's the pitch, which a lot of contributors listen and they say, okay, I will sit down and I will tell you about the worst day of my life. It will involve a lot of emotion and a lot of tears. It's not something easy. It requires courage to do that. So you need to know that the people that you're working for, you're on the same wavelength, that they will also have this commitment to treating the story with respect, treating the people with respect, and doing what's best for the series. And one other thing that this requires, it requires an investment. It requires an investment in time. It requires an investment in resources. So we spend a lot of time just searching for archive before we start filming anything. Then we spend another time searching for the contributors. And then even once we filmed with them and done everything, we spend very long edits because it takes a long time to get the film just right. So these are long projects and you need a partner that's completely committed to the ambition of the project and to quality and to honesty. And National Geographic, I think, well, they have a tremendous track record. They were very happy with 9/11. I think they're very happy with this series. So we work very well together.
Did you find at an emotional level much difference between the survivors of 9/11 and the survivors of the tsunami?
I think there are differences. I'm not sure at an emotional level. Obviously, you're often talking to mothers who lost their children, people who lost their brothers. So that's a loss so devastating. It's a universal type of pain. I think, and so obviously in both cases, there were very, very emotional interviews. But I think there are some differences in that with 9/11, the cause of this, the reason it happened, it was just because of other humans, because of evil. That's why it happened. Whereas with the tsunami, it happens because of a natural disaster. It isn't a human agency that's behind it. And so you see different responses from different people. So for instance, in Banda Aceh, which is a very religious country, Islamic, most time when you start asking people, why do you think this happened? Or there's a very answer, this was God's will. And there's not much more exploring after that. Places that are very religious, particularly Islam, you're not supposed to question God's will. And so it is an answer. It was, if you go to the Twin Towers, people will have probably more detailed answers about why God might be part of the equation as well. But it's just a different type of response. I think also with 9/11 and tsunami, with 9/11, when we were looking at other documentaries, there were thousands, other books, there were thousands. Even when I told people I'm working on a series of 9/11, they would sort of roll their eyes because they would think, well, what else can be said? And with the tsunami, I would speak to people and I would say, did you know that nearly 250,000 people died that day? And people were surprised. So even people who lived through it. So I think with 9/11, because it had such a big political impact, geopolitical impact in the world, we lived in a post 9/11 world after that. So it was very difficult to forget all the ramifications that came from that. Whereas with the tsunami, perhaps it was a bit like the Spanish influenza of 1918. It was a horrible, horrible tragedy. It was on the news for 6 months. I think people after that wanted to move on. So you have a new generation that just really doesn't know much about it.
It's interesting, your positive references about working with Nat Geo. Calista and I are just right now in the middle of working with PBS. We've done a film called Journey to America, which is a series of people who came to the United States legally and how much they've improved and contributed to the American experience. And we've found that working with the team at PBS must be a little bit like Nat Geo in that these are world-class institutions. They have very high standards to make sure that at every stage you're doing it the right way. So I really appreciate that. I have to confess, I've been a big fan of Nat Geo, but mostly for the animals.
I'm working on a documentary about a baby elephant for the BBC. So I love animals as well. That will be out next year.
Tell me about this baby elephant.
So it's basically in Kenya, and there's this huge reservation for elephants, a wildlife reservation. So they live freely. But what happens when a mother dies, for whatever reason, might be poachers, there's a baby elephant without a mother. That baby elephant usually will die. They need their mother. They completely depend on their mother. So what this reservation does is they rescue the baby elephant, but then somebody needs to be the mother. And that somebody is a man. In this case, he's called Joseph, an African man, a Kenyan man. And so he's going to be the elephant's mother for the next 3 years. I mean, 2 years have already passed. And he has to be with the baby 24 hours a day, feed him, teach him how to be an elephant. So compared to some of these other sad stories, it's incredibly moving and uplifting and inspirational. And the elephant is Toto. Absolutely beautiful and adorable. And he's doing very well now. So I think that will be out next year.
That's great. What a wonderful experience to be able to do something like that.
What I try to do is I try to mix stories which are very, very sad with stories which are very uplifting and hopeful. And the world is big and both kinds of stories are happening all the time. There's tremendous good happening in this world as well as tremendous bad. But I've worked with PBS as well. I did a film on Boko Haram many years ago, around the time the girls were kidnapped. And so we made a film exposing both Boko Haram and the atrocities they were committing and the Nigerian army in retaliatory violence. And it won an Emmy, and they were extraordinary to work with. You like to work with people like that who are very, very, very thorough about making sure all your facts are correct. And that's a relief because that's what you want.
Did you feel at all endangered trying to do a film about Boko Haram?
I worked with this journalist called Evan Williams, and he had gathered a bunch of videos, often in places where there are many human rights abuses. Videos are gathered of those abuses and are making the rounds. And so we said, well, let's make a film about this. And so we traveled there, but we couldn't go all the way to Maiduguri. It was just way too dangerous. So we went all the way north, and then we sent a fixer who would find the people in the videos and would bring him to us, and then we would do the interview. So we ourselves didn't put ourselves in too much danger. It was more for the people who were agreeing to tell the story of the abuses they had suffered. Often, obviously, we disguised their identity. So yeah, it was a very challenging project. In a way, what it shows the violence of Boko Haram, but then the violence that the army was committing against innocent civilians in their efforts to do something about what was happening. So it was a very sad story.
Well, and it's still going on.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The violence in Nigeria gets very little attention, but it's absolutely horrific.
You've managed to work your way into a fascinating career where you get to learn and do things that are very different. You're not locked in a room somewhere just working on your computer. You're out doing real things. And I think that's terrific. I want to thank you for joining me. I want to let our listeners know they can watch your terrific new documentary, Tsunami, Race Against Time, which is streaming now on Disney Plus and Hulu. Daniel, it has been a real joy to have a chance to talk with somebody who is as passionate, as committed, and as dedicated as you are. So thank you for taking this time to be with us.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you to my guest, Daniel Bogado. You can learn more about his new documentary, Tsunami, Race Against Time, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.